Welcome to my lecture. Here I would talk about the Iliad, and in this video I would introduce you to the great world of Homer. And this is the first segment of my lecture, and there will be many more videos on the Iliad in future. So it's a huge thing to grasp because it's an epic, and our age is not very familiar with this form of poetry. So we live in an age which tries to shorten everything. Even we have moved on from the messages that we used to convey through our mobile phones. We have moved on to WhatsApp emojis, right? So we are trying to shorten things, and this tendency of shortening things goes against the trend that we find in the great Homeric age. So let's see how we can reconcile between these two uh, different ages through these lectures. Now, what is an epic? If we ask this question, we have to consider that the English word epic comes from the Latin epicus, which itself comes from the ancient Greek adjective epikos, which again comes from epos, which means word, story, or poem. In modern Vulgate, which is the standard accepted version, the Iliad contains 15,693 lines, and it is written in what is known as quote unquote Homeric Greek, which is basically a literary amalgamation of Ionic Greek and several other dialects which were popular in that region. And this is a very great painting which you would find on the internet, where this is Hector, an epic hero, being killed by Achilles, and there's this god who comes to aid Achilles at that time. Now we would go back to that battle between Hector and Achilles, which happens almost towards the end of Iliad. And now, before going to those battles, since you already know that the Iliad is mostly about battle, and you must have watched that Hollywood movie called Troy, which again is very problematic in terms of understanding epics, because it's an adaptation of the Homeric epic. So never think that it's the Iliad, right? It's an adaptation of the Homeric story, and they have tried to humanize the elements. They have tried to reduce it to a kind of realistic paradigm, quote unquote. The conventions of realism have been followed. So in that way, it becomes quite problematic to understand the epic, and hence I would request you to think in a different way. So forget about your memories of that particular movie where you find Brad Pitt brandishing his muscles and his sword. So don't think of that movie, right? For the time being. Though you may like that movie, for the time being, just forget about it and concentrate on what I am going to talk about in this lecture. Now, first of all, we have to think of the problematic of authorship. And when I was assigned this text a few years back, I was quite perplexed that from where should I begin, because a story which is an epic has actually no beginning. It starts in media res, and which means in the middle of things. So where to start the discussion on Homeric epic? Now we can begin, or we may begin our discussion with the very problematic of authorship, which is known as the Homeric question. Basically, nothing is known for certain about the authorship of the Iliad, or about its date and place of composition. So we can't say anything with surety. And all the circumstances surrounding the composition and early transmission of the Homeric poems are matters of surmise and controversy. And have you noticed one thing, that continuously I am using the word Homeric instead of Homers, right? I'll tell you why later. Just point this down, note this down. And this together have become to be known as the Homeric question. So all this ambiguity, this surmise, this controversy forms what we know as the Homeric question. And this informed consensual conjecture, which we are going to talk about, is what we are left with amidst this atmosphere of ambiguity. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are the oldest surviving texts in Greek literature. Like in the context of India, we have the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So Ramayana and Mahabharata are the one of the oldest texts which we find in Indian literature, and they are part of the epic tradition. And these texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they exist in a historical vacuum. Why vacuum? No internal references to their author or to their origin can be found. First. Secondly, no other contemporary documents throw any light upon them. Third, no reliable tradition about their origin in the earliest Greek literature following them can be found. So there is great vacuum that we find, and hence this informed consensual conjecture made by several critics, several scholars, that the Greeks all agree on the name Homer, which is derived from Homerus. Now you will understand why am I using Homeric continuously instead of Homer's, the Iliad, Homer's, the Odyssey. So, or Homer's language, I'm using Homeric language or Homeric Greek, right? And this Homer, this word, got derived from Homeros, which means hostage or pledge. And there's a persistent tradition that, like the bard Demodocus in the Odyssey, he was blind. So there is a persistent tradition of conjectures who talks about this bard called Demodocus, who is found in the Odyssey, and he was blind, and hence you would often find this discussion that Homer was also blind. But different views are recorded concerning his death and birth, both. Okay, so the dates of his birth, the date of his death is not known. The dates are unknown regarding his birth, regarding his death, right? And there are 7 cities which claimed to be the birthplace of Homer. So Homer's birthplace is not at all known to us. So he's first of all compared with the bard in the Odyssey named Demodocus, who's also blind, and there are 7 cities of origin for Homer. And the most favored in antiquity is Chios and Smyrna, and both are in the region of Ionia. Ionia means in the region under the present day Western Turkey, in the Eastern Aegean Sea, which is a bay of Mediterranean Sea. Now you can see the map over here. It is a modern day map, and here you have Turkey, right? And this is Istanbul, and over here you have the Aegean Sea. I hope you can locate the Aegean Sea over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Ionian Sea. So we are primarily talking about this region, Greece, right? Athens is there, you can see. And Troy is somewhere over here in the western bank of Turkey, near the western bank of Turkey. And if you think of the story of the Iliad, you'd find that Agamemnon and his men went to Troy, right? So probably they crossed this Aegean Sea. They went from this part to this part, right? So this was their path. Okay, so roughly speaking, this is the location of Troy, and this is the location of the Ionian Greece, from where the Agamemnon and his men were thought to come. And again, there are certain other informed consensual conjecture made by several critics and scholars who are dealing with this ambiguity, that the Greeks believed in the historical reality of the Trojan War, but the reliability of the Homeric version was definitely questionable. And according to some accounts, he was a contemporary witness of event. There were several events, and he was a contemporary witness to those events. And according to others, his poem was composed sometime after the fall of Troy, an event which, in any case, was for the earliest Greek historians shrouded in the mists of prehistory. So this actually is completely shrouded; it is ambiguous in nature. And early literary resources report to us that the existence of a guild called the Homeridae, who, claiming to be the descendants of Homer, flourished in Chios and were devoted to the recitation of his poems. So there were other professional reciters of Homer's poetry who were known as rhapsodes, right? And rhapsody is a term which we often associate with music and poetry. And these professional reciters recited Homer's poetry from memory at public festivals and games where they competed with one another for prizes. So they used to recite these things. So we are talking about basically an oral tradition. We are not talking about a written tradition. That's why these ambiguities are there, right? So you have to understand this, that we are talking about a completely different paradigm. It's an oral paradigm which we are talking about, and that's why there is no specific text of the Iliad. There is no specific standardized version of the Iliad or the Odyssey for that matter. So the Homeric question also partakes of the German Homeric scholar, the findings of the German Homeric scholar Frederick Wolff, who first raised the Homeric question because of the lack of any known occasion for the composition of poems of this length, and also because of the difficulty of explaining how poems of this length and artistic unity could have been composed without the aid of writing. So these two were the problems that were raised by Frederick Wolff. And Wolff did not deny the existence of Homer, right? And Wolff believed that Homer had existed and had initiated the poems in their early form. Wolff declared in his Prolegomena ad Homerum, which is basically a critical introduction to Homer's works, and it was published in 1795, that the Homeric poems, as we know them, did not have a single author, but had progressively evolved as successive rhapsodes added and developed what had come down to them. So I am a part of, say, rhapsodes who recite poems professionally in games and festivals. So I have learned these things from my predecessors, and then I have learned this entire art of recitation of Homeric poems through the way in which you would learn poems at your childhood. That is, you would be part and parcel of the oral tradition. You would learn poems orally, and then you would memorize them, right? And then you would continuously recite. Now, how this happens actually? Do you need to remember each and every word? No. You have to remember the structure and the basic storyline, and then you continuously modify, maintaining the same structure, right? So in this way you would find multiple versions of the same story. So that's why epic has no end, no beginning, no particular story per se. There are stories and stories and stories, and layers are continuously say intertwined together, right? And this is why we have a complex network of stories, complex networks of narratives, where you have one character and then there would be origins of that character, and then again another character would be there who would be interacting with this character, and then that other character would have another origin story, right? And it would go on and on and on like this towards, say, infinite. And this infinite structure is known as the epic, basically. So that's why it's epic. The scale is huge. And some ancient scholars, known as the Corizontes or separators, had believed that the Iliad and the Odyssey were by different authors, and some ancient commentators had suspected that particular lines and even some episodes had been interpolated. But it was not until Woolf that unity of authorship of the individual poems was fundamentally questioned. Right? So, this is the idea. Woolf fundamentally questioned this very idea of Homer and Homer's poetry and how it got transmitted to the subsequent generations. So, archaeological research done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries suggests that the culture and events of the Homeric poems have some basis in historical truth. The Messenian civilization seems to center on Messene, which was excavated in 1876, an ancient city in the mainland Greece that flourished during 1400 to 1300 BC, and Agamemnon in the Iliad is said to belong to that city. And the site of Troy has been located in Hisarlik, which is in northern Turkey, and was excavated in the early 1870s. Right, so the Trojan War probably took place in the mid 13th century. Right, so this is the timeline. If you try to historicize the Trojan War, which you would find in the Iliad, you would find this kind of pattern. Right, now see, this is the ancient map that we can think of. You can find it on the internet, and you would find that these were the areas from which these heroes and these characters came, like Hector, Priam, Paris, Cuba, and Helen comes over here in the northwestern side of Turkey. This is Turkey, this is Aegean Sea, this is Mediterranean Sea, right? And this is Greece. And you have Ithaca over here, from which you have Odysseus and his wife Penelope. And there is Nestor, another important character. And then Helen and Menelaus used to live in Sparta, and then Helen gets abducted from this particular place, and she is brought to this place, Troy. So they travel like this, right? And we have Messene, Agamemnon, Clytemnestra would be over here. We have Achilles' place over here, and this is how it goes. We have Crete, Lycia, and several other places. Soon after this possible date for the fall of Troy, Messenian power began to decline until in about, say, 1120 BC, the Messeni, and with them the Messenian culture of the Bronze Age, that is 3200 to 600 BC, were destroyed by the Dorians, who invaded from the west. So the Dorians were themselves Greek speaking and possibly lived on the fringe of the Messenian Empire. They initiated what is usually known as the Dark Ages, lasting from 1100 to 800 BC. So the Bronze Age gave way to the New Age of Iron, and refugees from the dispersal in mainland Greece created by the Dorian invasion now began to colonize the eastern seaboard of the Aegean Sea, known as the Ionia in Asia Minor. And the Homeric poems are generally considered to have been composed in Ionia. Largely on, it is largely based on the linguistic grounds, and they may therefore preserve the memory of the Messenian mother culture transmitted by those who had colonized Asia Minor. This is again a very, very important conjecture, a very, very interesting fact that we can think of when we study Homer or we deal with the Homeric questions. And the Homeric poems also record practices and customs that differ from those of the Messenian times. For example, the Messenians buried their dead, while in Homer, the dead are cremated. So there are discrepancies between the Messenian culture and again the culture that we find in Homer's poems. So again, there is this problem that whether actually the Homeric poems depict Messenian culture is quite questionable. And in Messenian warfare, one spear was used, while Homer's warriors habitually carry two spears. And experts on warfare note that the tactics employed at, say, Book 13, line 131 to 135, imply the use of the phalanx, and which is an organized line of hoplites. Hoplites were infantrymen that did not come into being until the development of the city state. That is possibly suggesting a date as late as 800 BC. So this was not possible before that. So there are several discrepancies of this sort. When we try to historicize Homer, these are the problems that we encounter, right? And some have thought that these scenes from the ordinary life in the similes are those of Homer's own day, and that Homer is deliberately drawing parallels between a heroic past and a humble present. So this is also a very, very interesting conjecture that we find, that when Homer is depicting, or if Homeric poets are depicting, they are depicting the story of, say, past civilization. They are also trying to compare that past culture with their own culture, right? So they are comparing their present with their past. And the Iliad, or the pan-Hellenic consciousness, needs to also be taken into account over here. In the 8th century BC, the recovery of Greek civilization becomes apparent as we observe a cluster of events which imply a new sense of Greek identity. And hence, the language of Homer is a fusion of elements from various dialects, the chief of which are the Ionic, the Aeolic, and the Arcadian. The Arcadian and Aeolic dialects developed from dialects of Greek spoken in mainland Greece in the south and north, respectively, during the Messenian period. And the fusion of these dialects with the Ionic has contributed to the view that Ionic bards took over and adapted new circumstances and a new audience material which they had inherited from the past. Right? So the language that we find in Homer had been purposefully developed for poetic recitation, and it was never a spoken language. Nor did such a development, any more than the myths or the tales themselves, originate with one genius. So there is a consensus of scholarly opinion that the language of Iliad and Odyssey evolved over many centuries, and that its technique of formulaic diction goes back to the Messenian age, from which it was no doubt transmitted by practicing bards like Demodocus and Phemius, whom we find in the Odyssey. And if you think of the language of the Homeric meter, it's basically dactylic hexameter. It is an arrangement of long and short syllables according to fixed rules. For instance, am is a short syllable and arm is a long syllable. So you have I'm talking to my students that you have done syllabification with me before, and there were no concept of long and short syllables, right? Syllable means a particular element, and there were no varieties into that. And here in the Homeric meter, we find long and short syllable as well. So dactylic hexameter, which is also known as heroic hexameter, which you have to remember, which is the meter of the epic. So dactylic hexameter is the meter of the epic. It's a form of meter or rhythmic scheme in poetry. And Homer's verse is formulaic. So the poets would understand and memorize these formulaic compositions. This is the theory which originated in the scholarly study of epic poetry, and this was developed in the second quarter of the 20th century, and it seeks to explain two related issues: the process by which oral poets improvise poetry, and the reasons why oral improvised poetry or written poetry deriving from traditions of oral improvisation has the characteristics as it does. Right? So oral formulaic composition comes up with this idea that the theory is that poets have a store of formulas, a formula being an expression that is regularly used under the same metrical conditions. So I'm talking about this formula. Why? Because see, this is what the poets used to remember. They need not remember, they never remembered the entire story verbatim as they learned from their masters. They used to remember these formulas, they used to internalize these formulas, and then what they used to do, they used to reproduce them while they used to recite the entire story in the festival. So that's why you would have, in the context of India, you would find multiple versions of Ramayana, multiple versions of Mahabharata, right? So this is what is about the oral composition, right? And you would find that there are phrases that would be used, like swift-footed Achilles. We translate it in English, modern day English, glancing helmed Hector. So that is how Hector and Achilles would be referred. Most of the characters would be referred. There would be one compound adjectives before their names, right? And if we talk about the written text, the earliest written text of Homer, for which there's an evidence in Greek sources, this dates from the late 6th century BC, when the Athenian leader of the day is reported to have brought texts of the poems to Athens and to have required the rhapsodes who recited Homer's poetry at the annual Athenian festival to do so one after another in proper order so that the poems would be recited as a whole, right? And there were standardizations of this text. So first textual criticism of Homer was carried out in the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC in Alexandria, which is a famous library and which was demolished later on. And this standardized text, which got standardized in Alexandria, is the ancestor of all the texts that we have now in the modern world, right? And there have been many editions of the Iliad since the first edition printed in Florence in 1488, that is during the Renaissance, right? And this is how the revival of the classics happened during the Renaissance. You have learned about Renaissance, right? In the previous semester, I'm talking to my students directly, that you have learned about Renaissance, and you must have realized that how Renaissance is all about revival of the classics, revival of the ancient texts. This is one key example that you can think of. And a reliable modern text of the Greek is the Oxford Classical Text of the Iliad, edited by T.W. Allen in 3 volumes, which was published by the Clarendon Press, Oxford, in 1931. Right. So, in the next discussion, we will talk about the structure and form of this particular text called the Iliad, which is not a written text per se, but an epic text, right? So till then, have a great day.